Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, Merryn Talks Money listeners. Just before we get started with today's episode and how things are changing for UK landlords, I wanted to flag that we're hosting an event at Bloomberg's European headquarters in London on Thursday, November 27th. Merryn Talks the Budget. We're recording the show live in front of an audience the morning after Rachel Reeves's UK budget, so join us for croissants and coffee and conversation. Regular podcast guest Helen of Blonde Money, who's one of the smartest political commentators out there, certainly in my experience, is going to be one of our guests. So you won't want to miss it. So find the registration link in the show notes. Welcome to Merryn Talks Your Money, the personal finance edition of Merryn Talks Money. In these bonus podcasts, we talk about the best strategies for making the most of your money. I'm John Stepek, senior reporter and Money Distilled author. Merryn is currently still on holiday, but fear not, later this week we'll be bringing you a conversation she had with the great Art Laffer, economist, author and inventor of the Laffer curve. He's just co-authored a new book focused on revitalising the UK economy, so you really won't want to miss that one. Tune in later this week. But for this conversation, we're focusing on the new rules of being a UK landlord. So we're talking about the Renters' Rights Bill, which was introduced to Parliament last year and is expected to pass into law before the end of this year. It represents the most comprehensive overhaul of UK tenancy rules in decades, but it is proven to be quite controversial. So let's get into what's changing and how landlords will be affected with my guest today. There's Helen Chandler-Wilde, who's a Bloomberg reporter who just published a really comprehensive take on all this, and Stuart Trow, Bloomberg opinion columnist, co-host of Money on Switch Radio, and author of The Bluffer's Guide to Economics. And he's also a landlord. So we've got first-hand experience today. Now I'm going to start with you, Helen. Can you talk us through what the Renters' Rights Bill actually is, what the main changes are?
Sure. So it's pretty comprehensive and complex piece of legislation, but one of the most important and most discussed things is the end of no-fault evictions. So basically that means that once you've rented a property, your landlord can't boot you out just because they want to have someone else move in or something like that. The only reasons that they can boot you out is if they themselves want to move back into the property, if they want to sell it, or if their family wants to move back in. And another really massive change is the end of fixed term tenancies. So at the moment, it's very normal when you rent a property to rent on a year-long contract or a 2-year contract. But now that will be ended. People do find those convenient, both renters and landlords. So say if you're moving and your work has said you've got to move to London for a year, you want to get a year tenancy. But now everyone will just be going month to month. So basically your contract will last indefinitely, but with a minimum tenancy of 12 months at the start where the landlord can't ask you to leave for any reason. And
just to be clear on this, so if that's rolling month-to-month contracts, but that doesn't mean the landlord can tell you to leave the month with a month's notice, does it? Okay, so just the tenant can leave with a month's notice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The whole point of the bill is that it's trying to shift power from landlords back onto tenants. So obviously, anyone who's read any sliver of news over the last 20 years knows that houses are very expensive and that is a massive problem in people's lives. And the intention of the bill is to try and help tenants. So in London at the moment, if you want to rent just one room in a shared flat, the average of that is £1,000 a month. And then on top of that, obviously you have your council tax, all your bills and everything. So it's super expensive. And on top of that, because of the housing shortages that we have, landlords have a lot of power. So people can be kicked out or their rent can be raised on them with no notice, and you just don't really have another option as a tenant. So they're trying to address that by flipping the power over to the tenants by saying that you can leave when it's convenient for you, but the landlord can't kick you out. That's the intention of the bill. However, I'm not entirely sure we can discuss this if that is going to be the effect of it. Because lots of things we've seen throughout history, rent controls sound amazing, all those things sound amazing, but when you're trying to manipulate and intervene in supply and demand economics, you're probably not going to get the outcome that you want.
Yeah, because this is the other thing, isn't it? if the landlord changes the rent and you disagree with it as the tenant, you can take them to a tribunal. Is that the story?
Yes.
And up until the tribunal decides, you pay the original rent.
Yes, and also landlords can only raise the rent once a year from this time going forwards. And so basically, if rent increases can be looked at by this tribunal system where they will be judged in accordance with what rents are generally. And there's another change as well that I didn't mention before about pricing, which is that at present, when you go and in London, you try and rent a flat and it's very stressful. You go for a viewing, there's a million other people there. And then afterwards, it's more like what people might be used to when they're buying somewhere, where afterwards you get into a bidding process. But you now do bids with rents as well. So people will be bidding against each other saying, how much can I pay a month for this? And so it will almost always go for above the asking price. So that's now illegal as well. So you'll basically just advertise the price of the flat, and that's the price you have to go for. Unfortunately, the problem is that hasn't addressed the fact that there's just not enough supply for the demand that there is. So landlords will still get loads of people wanting to rent their place. So they will have to filter. If you can't filter by price, you're going to filter by something else. This is an example for a friend of mine who lived in Paris for many years, where they have rent controls. She is extremely, even harder than in London, to find a place to live. It's so hard because the supply is effectively reduced. And everyone is going for these flats that are on the market. So the filtering mechanism that the landlords use is they'll ask you to supply your bank statements for years and years and years into the past, because they basically want to find the most reliable tenant that they can for their property, who they're most sure will be able to keep paying the rent and they won't default on them. That unfortunately means that the richest people are still getting the flats. It's just that you're basically giving rich people a discount on their rent. That is not what anyone thought would happen when they introduced those policies. That is not the intention of it. And that is not a good outcome for anyone except for the rich renters who are now randomly getting a discount. So I'm just saying that that's another example of where what you want to happen is not necessarily what will happen. I completely understand. It's so awful being a tenant because there are so many people going after these flats and so few flats. But if you're just trying to make that transaction harder for people, it won't necessarily help anyone in the long run. Or maybe it will help some people, but they might be a minority. The fundamental issue is we haven't built many flats, especially in London. The building is just not happening. So, yeah.
Are you currently renting, Helen?
I actually own a flat, which I bought a few years ago, and I cannot tell you the difference in my quality of life from getting out of the rental market, because I have had every form of crazy landlord that there is. I've had damp issues. I had one where, admittedly, we did scratch the lino a little bit in the kitchen from moving the fridge, but it was 2 inches. She tried to charge us $4,000 to fix that, and the quote she gave us was for replacing the flooring in the entire flat with, it had been lino before. She wanted to replace it with solid wood. And it's we had to take her to a tribunal to argue. That's just crazy. That's not fair. So I have seen both sides of it, and I'm very glad to be out of that now, basically.
At this point, I'll bring you in, Stuart.
And that's not a diss against Stuart. I'm sure he's a lovely, lovely landlord, to be clear. There are some good ones.
I do think this is an issue here, though, because you're right. I mean, one of the problems is that there is the economic issue, which is rent controls basically don't work. On the other hand, there are so many horror stories on both sides.
Exactly.
Because landlords have awful tenants, but tenants have awful landlords. I mean, I haven't rented for a long time, but I remember even 20 years ago when I was renting, it was an absolute minefield. It was Cowboysville. And to be absolutely honest, in my experience, the worst people were not actually the landlords. They were the people in between, the sort of property agents, the kind of really dodgy, sleazy kind of tenancy managers, things like that. And I understand that side of things has been tidied up a little bit. But what's your take on this, Stuart? Because at the same time, we were talking about the end of Section 21 tenancies here, but so as I understand it, the idea, the landlord can't just kick you out even now. you are correct. What is it? A minimum is 6 months that you're assured short hold tenancy. Is that right?
Well, under the old system, it was 2 months' notice. So once the fixed period of the tenancy was had expired, the contract could be rolled over. So you didn't have to have a new tenancy, which often agents would insist on a new tenancy. You didn't actually have to have that. You'd do what was called rolling over. Tenant needs to give 1 month's notice, you'd need to give 2 months' notice. So that was the kind of old system. And to be honest, I don't really see too much problem with the ending of no fault evictions per se, because basically if we've got a good tenant, we always say to tenants moving in, they're paying the rent and not smashing the place up, we're happy for them to stay as long as possible because we were committed to the market in that sense. There are unintended consequences, such as ending fixed terms make it very difficult to manage something like student accommodation, where you kind of only need it for a fixed term. And then if you get one student who wants to stay, but that's not an area where we necessarily rent in anyway. But, that's an example of the unintended consequences you get. In terms of arbitration, I absolutely think that's a positive development as long as it's resourced properly. Because, one of the problems is that if tenants' complaints aren't addressed, they effectively become a story that can fester. So, if you've got a chance to put up or shut up, say, well, the landlord did X, Y, Z, and somebody who's in a position to know how the market works can say, well, yeah, that's wrong, they shouldn't be doing that, and can make a ruling, that's great. And likewise, if they're saying, look, this is frivolous, you've not paid your rent for 6 months, you're just sort of trying to string that's good in terms of getting things out into the open. And, there's a lot that I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. What I'd say, though, is that one of the fundamental problems that Helen alluded to was that the kind of ship has sailed in terms of whether being a landlord is a worthwhile occupation anyway. Financially, you're not actually covering your cost of capital. Even if you're all equity, you've got an implied cost of capital. And, that has practical consequences. It means that when you have to do any work to meet EPC regulations, or, you're building new developments, stuff like that, the easiest way of funding that is by selling parts of your existing portfolio, because that's the cheapest funding you're going to get. And, from my perspective as a landlord, that's not what we're doing currently, but it means that as properties become available, the best use of that capital that's freed up is actually to pay down debt and then exit the market. Because you can't justify reinvesting capital to produce more capacity.
This is sort of the crux of the issue at the moment, isn't it? It's like all of these regulations are being introduced because of problems that arise from there not actually being enough property where there needs to be. As I recall, at least, sort of landlords started to become public enemy number one around about 2015 when George Osborne started with the rules on getting rid of, you could claim mortgage interest payments against your, your cost of doing business, and now you can't unless you incorporate. What was the point of doing that? What was the goal? Basically, what is the goal being behind trying to annihilate the amateur landlord? Because that has been government policy for about a decade now.
Well, I think there are quite a few misconceptions about how the property market actually works, and in particular how it affects people who can't access the owner-occupied market. So Helen was in a very fortunate position being able to say, right, I don't like being a tenant, I'll be a home owner instead. And that's great. And we're seeing a lot of that from landlords. Landlord sales have been absorbed by first-time buyers to a certain extent. So wealthier tenants are actually probably, well, it's wrong to say they're living their best lives because rent is phenomenally expensive, but at least they've got a reasonable amount of choice. That the crisis element comes from the people displaced as small landlords exit, because small landlords tend to occupy the the cheaper end of the market. I know rents don't seem cheap, but relatively speaking. So when you get displaced from that, you've got no place to go. So that's why social housing waiting lists are over 1 million. That's why I think the latest figure is either 132 or 134,000 families are in emergency accommodation, which is a phenomenally expensive way of housing anybody. And and a further extreme is, obviously we've got tens of thousands of people living on the street. So it's not for wealthier tenants that there's the problem. And in fact, to be honest, the Renters' Rights Bill will significantly strengthen the situation for wealthier tenants, but it won't necessarily do very much to address the emerging problem with people who struggle to access the private rental market in the first place.
And I think also on the historical point that you're saying about those timelines, after the financial crash when interest rates were effectively zero, property was actually a pretty attractive investment because it was one place that you could still get a return as property prices were going up, and everywhere else, like, you're chasing zero interest. So I kind of have often wondered if that was a compensatory mechanism to force people to not pour so much of their assets and wealth into the property market and look for other returns elsewhere, because it was just a weird period of loads of distortions for wealth.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, extreme monetary easing brought about all manner of misallocations of capital. But I think one of the other issues, though, is that the boom that preceded 2008 crash was largely driven by investors buying property off plan, and that hasn't worked out very well, because these are the properties with the cladding issues. These are the properties that built on floodplains. These are the properties that, even for fairly benign reasons, appear to be unmortgageable and hence unsaleable. So, to characterise buy-to-let investing as risk-free is missing the point. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of properties in the UK today that you can't raise a mortgage on that you might have been able to do 10, 15 years ago.
How much of this is London versus the rest of the UK problem? I quite often look at house prices, and when you look at house prices, you kind of realise that the real issue is mostly in the southeast, and there are parts of North England particularly that haven't seen house prices move since about 2000 in nominal terms, let alone real terms. So how much of this is because all of the people who talk and write about this stuff kind of live within or slightly without the M25?
I think that was a reasonable argument to have made a few years ago, but when I was speaking to people for the piece, all of the landlords and stuff I was speaking to, they were saying that all the excitement now, zero excitement in London South East, all the landlords are looking at other areas because that is where you're still getting a reasonable annual return on the investment of buying the place compared to what the rent is, and also where property prices are still going up, because in London, as you, John, have written about, property prices are just not going up. So and there are definitely issues with cowboy landlords everywhere, and a particular problem that we have seen in regional places is where there have been these massive growths of universities that puts a massive pressure on the rental market, because obviously then there's suddenly tens of thousands of people who want to rent places, and that has pushed up rents in places and made it very difficult. If you are living in Durham, say, and you're not a student and you want to rent somewhere, you're competing against all of these people. Some students are international students with a lot of money, and that obviously puts a lot of pressure on places.
Is there any kind of solution to this? I know, Stuart, you've written a lot about the problem in London. Because at the moment, nobody's building anything in London. And presumably this just adds more reasons not to do that, because basically the argument is that you're not getting compensated with a yield or a return that's commensurate with the risk you're taking. And more regulation just increases the cost without, doing anything about the kind of return. So, I mean, what is the solution here? Because presumably it's not deregulation. Is it planning rules? What is it?
Well, it's a combination of things, but basically investment has to pay at the end of the day. Just working on a piece at the moment, the fundamental issue is if you're a house owner or you're looking to buy a property at the moment, it's difficult to see the sense of crisis in the market because, there's plenty of supply around if you're looking to buy. And if you're an owner, it's taking ever longer to sell simply because there's a surplus of stock there. And the real problem is, we discussed before, is that further down the value chain, people are finding it hard to access the private rental market. So if you're wealthy enough to be able to rent, and it's quite a high hurdle to do that, by and large, renters' rights bill will help you. And although it's very expensive to do so, you can access the market. It's the people who can't access the market that are having the problem and are causing a knock-on cost for government and exchequer and all the rest of it. And, there's a fundamental truism, and I know people will argue against it, but it's difficult to get away from it. You can't have subsidised housing without the subsidy. And, the way London has chosen to do that is to insist that up to 35% of a new development is earmarked for affordable housing. But the housing associations that generally take that on board haven't got the finance to even take up their share of that, which has resulted in, I don't know the exact number, but certainly thousands, if not tens of thousands of completed new properties that are standing empty simply because the housing association can't take their mandated share, and the developers can't free up enough capital to be able to move on, develop something else. So, so that's a fundamental problem. But then also construction costs have gone through the roof, if you've got to remediate for environmental standards, which is great. And, there's no reason why that shouldn't be done. But one of the anomalies is there's a very easy arbitrage. If you're a landlord looking to sidestep the EPC regulations, well, you simply sell your property because there are no EPC requirements for owner-occupied property. So, your flat is literally worth more in the owner-occupied sector than it is as a rental investment.
Well, yes, that's so. I suppose if we bring it back to the personal finance side of things, I think there's an obvious answer to this one, but Stuart, is now a good time to become a first-time landlord?
No, not really. There's strategic reasons why people might want to do that. If they wanted to say they were moving abroad to work, they might want to keep a toehold in the UK market. So renting out their property, that can work. But in general, as an investment, you're not going to realise the returns. And clearly the financial aspect is one thing, but also I'm very conscious as a landlord the atmosphere has been made extremely toxic.
One last point I'd like to make is just in general, when you're looking at policy announcements at the moment, I would just be very, very cautious about believing things as they're written down, because one problem is that we just don't have capacity in loads of public services. So things like when they say, oh, don't worry, if you want to return to your property, you can just give the tenant notice and they will leave. That's actually very complicated by the fact that there can be, in some places, a year-long delay to get bailiffs. So on paper, sure, that is the law, but in practice, that may not be the law. So, and that happens just across the board with all policies at the moment, that absolutely basically nowhere is actually following the letter of the law of what we're meant to be doing, because there's just capacity issues everywhere.
Yeah, it feels as if, you're right, there's this gap between, there's the question if the regulations would be right even if they worked as advertised. But yeah, there's the whole backlog everywhere. And I guess one of the points people have been making is that the economically rational thing, if not the kind of moral thing for any tenant to do, would always be to challenge any raise in rent, because it's going to take so long to clear the backlog that they could still be paying their original rent by the time they actually want to leave. First-time buyers, any implications for them?
I'm not sure, but it could be slightly preferable because often the places that are rented are those smaller properties which a first-time buyer might also want to buy. The problem is what their rental journey will have looked like by the time they save their deposit. If this inadvertently makes it more difficult, more expensive, will that make it harder to save your deposit in the first place? Who knows? We'll have to wait and see.
Is there anything else either you want to add in or you think we haven't covered?
Well, we didn't get time to talk about EPCs and the environmental certificates, but the rules on those are also being tightened up, which is quite tricky in the UK because we have a lot of old buildings and they can be hard to make energy efficient. So that is also a bit of a question, but you could read my piece if you want to know more.
Yes, yet another expense.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, look, thanks very much, both of you. Really appreciate you coming in to share your expertise today.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening to this week's Merryn Talks Your Money. If you like our show, rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also be sure to follow me and Merryn on X/Twitter. Merryn's at MerrynSW and I'm John_Stepek. What are you guys on Twitter?
I'm H_Chandler-Wilde with no hyphen.
And I'm at Pensionman UK.
This episode was produced by Summer Sadie and Moses Andam. Questions and comments on this show and all our shows are always welcome. Our show email is merrynmoney@bloomberg.net. And don't forget to check the show notes for your early morning breakfast slot Thursday, November 27th, where we'll be taking apart the budget.